Good morning. Well, today we are back in Luke chapter 12. Last week we jumped ahead to the very end of this gospel and we spent time in Luke chapter 24 for Resurrection Sunday. But today we are picking back up where we left off 2 weeks ago, and we're going to finish Luke chapter 12 together. And we're going to do so by thinking through Luke chapter 12 verses 54 through 59. So let's grab our Bibles and turn there together. I'll read aloud. You feel free, just right where you're at, to read aloud as well or follow along. Then we will pray together, asking for God's help as we think through his word. So here we go. Luke chapter 12 begins with verse 54. He also said to the crowds, "When you see a cloud rising in the west, you say at once, 'A shower is coming,' and so it happens. And when you see the south wind blowing, you say, 'There will be scorching heat,' and it happens. You hypocrites! You know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time? And why do you not judge for yourselves what is right? As you go with your accuser before the magistrate, make an effort to settle with him on the way, lest he drag you to the judge, and the judge hand you over to the officer, and the officer put you in prison. I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the very last penny." Let's pray together. God, I'm very thankful that during the time that we find ourselves in, that we can still continue to study your word together, to proclaim it, to think through it together, and apply what your word has to say to each one of us, but especially to our local church. And so I ask for your help on this very day as we each listen together to what you have to say, that we will listen intently, but I'm reminded even now as I ask that, knowing that you have given us your Holy Spirit as our helper, and to help us at such a time as this to be reminded of your truth, to be taught it, to understand it, to have our eyes open to it, and apply it to our lives. So I thank you that we're not alone. We're never alone. And in the study of your word, what a blessing it is to do so with your help in thinking through these things and understanding them. So thank you for today, and thank you for your special help in this moment. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, Luke chapter 12, I've been thinking as a significant chapter. Luke chapter 12 is a significant chapter, and it is significant in two ways. The first is that Luke chapter 12 is significant for us. And the second way is this: Luke chapter 12 is significant for Luke. So how is Luke 12 a significant chapter for us? Well, here's how. It is significant for us as a local church because it has come to us at the right time. The way I've been thinking about this chapter, especially in the time that we're in, is with this kind of headline: God knows what we need, when we need it, before we need it. I want to remind you that we began studying the Gospel of Luke close to a year and a half ago. It was in December of 2018, and as we began our study of Luke's Gospel, we did so with chapter 1. And as we have journeyed through this great Gospel, we have paused at different times for different reasons and gone to other parts of the Bible. But here we are continuing in our study of Luke's Gospel, and we find ourselves in Luke chapter 12. And what has happened as we have studied this chapter? Well, we find ourselves in a pandemic. And it's during this pandemic that we have heard Jesus say things like, "Do not be anxious about your life." It is during this pandemic that we have heard Jesus say things like, "Stay dressed for action and keep your lamps burning." It is also during this pandemic, as we stay at home, that we have heard Jesus say things like, "For from now on, in one house, there will be 5 divided." Now we've explored what those things mean, but I keep coming back to how timely it has been for us. And it's why I think this chapter is significant for us. It's because of the time that we find ourselves in. It's been significant at a time like this for a time like this. But Luke chapter 12 is not just significant for us. Luke chapter 12 is significant for Luke. That is, this chapter is a significant chapter in the overall work of Luke's gospel. Well, how so? Well, this chapter is different. It's not like the preceding chapters at all. And the way that it is different is how the chapter begins. As soon as this chapter begins, Luke draws our attention to who has gathered together in this moment. Look what Luke does as soon as the chapter begins in verse 1, just as a reminder. As the chapter begins, and this is why it's so different, it's not like the previous chapters. Luke draws our attention that in the meantime, Luke chapter 12 takes place when so many thousands of the people had gathered together. This chapter takes place when thousands upon thousands of people have gathered together in the same location at the same time for the same reason. And what is that reason? The reason is Jesus. And what is so significant about this, or so different, is that this is the largest group that has gathered together so far in Luke's gospel. The largest group so far. And the way that Luke tries to picture it for us, to get us to wrap our minds around it, he uses a word to describe the people, to describe the amount of people. The word is myriad, which simply means 10,000. And it's Luke's way of saying there are so many people, you can't even count them. It's innumerable. This is a large group that has gathered together in one place at the same time for the same reason. And that reason, again, is what? That reason is Jesus. This group has gathered together to see Jesus. And they've gathered together to see Jesus, to see what he might do, what he might do for one of them, and especially to hear what he might say to them. So this chapter is different for that reason. It's the largest group ever that has gathered together in one place to see Jesus, to see him do something, to hear him say something. And so as this group gathers, what does Jesus do? Well, he turns his attention to his disciples right away. He knows the group has gathered, and he knows why they are there. But as soon as they gather, when they gather, he turns his attention to his disciples. Most of this chapter is to and for Jesus' disciples. Jesus spends most of this chapter giving his time, giving his attention to those who want to grow in their relationship with Jesus and help others do the same. Now, this group that's gathered, they're rather eager to either see Jesus do something or to hear Jesus say something. They're so eager, Luke tells us right there at the beginning, they're trampling one another. So you can imagine, Jesus is making them wait. And as he makes them wait, they are growing so impatient. Here he is, he's talking to the disciples, giving all his time to them, not seeming rushed, not feeling rushed to give in to the crowd, to do something for them or to say something to them. And finally, one person in the crowd can't take it anymore, and he interrupts. Now, Jesus will respond to him, but he'll quickly, when he's done, go back to giving his attention to his disciples. And it's not until the very end of the chapter, the very close, starting there with verse 54, that Jesus finally gives the crowd what they have been waiting for. Now, something else that makes this chapter so different is that Jesus speaks to this crowd in a way that he has never spoken to a crowd yet. And the way that is so different, the way that he speaks to a crowd that is so different than any other time, he calls this crowd hypocrites. It's right there in verse 56. You hypocrites. Now imagine, they've been waiting a really long time for Jesus to say something to them. And when he finally does, it's just simply 2 words. You hypocrites. Now, pay attention there to verse 56, and pay attention to that word hypocrite. In the New Testament, that word hypocrite is only recorded in the Gospels. And it's only recorded in 3 of the Gospels. That word hypocrite appears a lot in the book of Matthew. In fact, it appears there more than any other gospel. It appears 1 time in the Gospel of Mark, and it appears in Luke. I thought that was kind of interesting. That word hypocrite is never recorded in the book of John. John never records that word, and he never records Jesus saying that word. Now here is something else interesting. That word hypocrite, the last time it appears in the New Testament is in Luke chapter 13, and it's verse 15. So here in verse 56 of chapter 12, this is the second to last time we are going to read this word, hypocrite. And I think that's kind of significant. And it's kind of what makes Luke chapter 12 a significant chapter to this entire gospel. Now, how might we think of that word hypocrite? How might we be able to define it? It literally means a performer. It's a word that would be used of actors, those who are in the theater, those who perform on TV or in the movies. It literally means an actor, a performer. And a way it's used is one who performs with a mask on. In other words, you're not really seeing the real person. A person is acting to be another person. So we want to ask this question as we begin. What has this crowd done that Jesus would call them hypocrites? I kind of think this. I think calling someone a hypocrite is probably the worst thing you could say to someone. It's probably the worst thing you could say about somebody. I'd rather be called anything else but a hypocrite. I'd rather be called anything else than a pretender. I'd rather be called anything else than phony. See, this is pretty significant. The largest group ever so far that has gathered to see Jesus do something or hear him say something, when he finally gives in to them, he calls them simply hypocrites. So we want to know, why does Jesus do that, and why does he do it now? The weather. If you watch the local news, the most popular segment of the local news is what? It's the weather. It's the one segment everybody waits for. And they wait for that segment every broadcast, every day. The most popular segment is the weather. Now, I think the most annoying thing about the weather segment is this. It's when the weatherman gives the report outside. I've always wondered, what's the point of that? I could easily look outside and get the weather report, but here's the weatherman giving the weather report outside. I find that to be terribly annoying. But a reason that Jesus calls this crowd hypocrites, well, it has something to do with the weather. Look how this end of the chapter begins. Look how this paragraph begins. Look at verse 54. And we're also going to look at verse 55. But note this in verse 54. And a reason that Jesus calls this group hypocrites, pretenders, phony, performers that have a mask on, has something to do with the weather. Verse 54, he also said to the crowds, when you see a cloud rising in the west. Okay, now let's pause there and read it one more time. When you see a cloud rising in the west. Now let's jump ahead to verse 55. Jesus says one more time, and when you see the south wind blowing. What does Jesus draw the crowd's attention to? He draws their attention to the weather. He draws their attention to a cloud rising in the west, and he draws their attention to the south wind blowing. And each time he does it, he says it with these words. When you see a cloud rising, or in verse 55, and when you see the south wind blowing. Now, I understand seeing a cloud rise in the sky. What I had trouble understanding is, how do you see the wind blowing? See, a better way of thinking about this is this way. When you observe a cloud rising in the west, and when you observe the south wind blowing. So note that word, when you observe. And when you observe, you're observing what? You're observing facts. It's just a fact that you see a cloud in the sky. That's undeniable. And where do you see the cloud in the sky? It's in the west. Now, this would have been significant for the crowd because in the west was the Mediterranean Sea. So they're seeing a cloud come up from over the Mediterranean Sea. And the south wind, well, south of here would have been a desert. So the wind is coming up out of the desert. And you have to note this. What they are observing are just plainly facts. It's undeniable. There's a cloud rising in the west. There's a wind blowing from where? The south. Undeniable facts. It's their observations. Note that. These are their observations. And the question is, what do they do with the facts? What do they do with the observations? Well, Jesus tells us. Look at verse 54. When you see a cloud rise in the west, when you observe that happening, what do? You say at once, a shower is coming, a storm is coming. Now, what might we call that? We can call that, how about this? An interpretation. It's an interpretation based upon what? The facts. That's really important to hold on to. This is interpretation based on the facts. And what does Jesus say about their interpretation when they see that cloud coming up out of the west? You say a shower is coming, and what does Jesus say about their interpretation? And so it happens. In other words, the interpretation is correct. And it applies again there in verse 55. When you see the south wind blowing, you say, what's the interpretation? There will be scorching heat. And what does Jesus say about their interpretation of the facts? It's correct. And it happens. Now notice what Jesus does not say. He does not say what they do with the interpretation. Now, they must do something, right? But what is it that you think they might do when they say a shower's coming, a storm is coming? What do you think they might do? They must do something with it, right? Otherwise, what's the point? If you make this observation about the weather and you say what is going to happen, what's the point unless you do something about it? And so when a shower is coming, I'm sure what they do is get prepared. And how might they get prepared? I don't know. Maybe locate their umbrella, make sure it's working, make sure they have a raincoat. What is that thing that old ladies put over their head? That little bag, grocery bag looking thing to protect their hair, and they tie it underneath their chin. Why do you do that? Because you're observing the weather. It's raining, so what do I need to do? I need to apply the interpretation, the facts to my life. They get into action. And it's the same thing with the heat. When they say heat is coming, it's going to be a scorcher tomorrow, what do? I'm sure they must turn the AC on. I'm sure they must think, let's go buy ice cream. Let's go make some sweet tea. They do something in preparation for what is coming. So note this. Note what Jesus is doing for us. It starts with what? Observation. And the observation deals only with the facts. And after the facts, they move where? Interpretation. A shower is coming. A storm is coming. It's going to be a scorcher tomorrow. What do you think they do then with the interpretation? There must be application. And if not, what's the point? What does it matter if tomorrow's going to be hot? What's it matter if a storm is coming if you're not going to do something about it? If you're not going to get prepared? What does it matter? What's the point unless you do some application? And it's just interesting, Jesus doesn't bring that up because I think it's assumed. Now notice what Jesus says next. He then calls them, it's there in verse 56. He says, you hypocrites. What does the weather have to do with calling them hypocrites. Well, again, hypocrites is meaning it's a performer who's just putting a mask on, performing with a mask covering who they really are. And Jesus says, here's how you are hypocrites. You know how to interpret the weather. You know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky. And they ask a very important question. But why do you not know how to interpret the present time? What's he getting at? Why is this group here? Why have they gathered together in the same location at the same time for the same reason? It is to do what? It is to see Jesus. And this group has gathered together to see Jesus for two reasons. They know that Jesus has done some remarkable things. And they know that Jesus has said some astounding things. Part of the reputation Jesus had was that no one has ever taught the Bible like this man. So this group has gathered to see him, to observe him do something, and to observe him say something. And part of the reason is they know he has done remarkable things, and they know he has said some astounding things. Now I want you to pay attention to this. There is a very important reason you are listening to this right now. And the important reason is this. The reason you are listening to this right now is that you know Jesus has done some things, and you know that Jesus has said some things. The question is, what will you do with it? That word hypocrite. How can we understand that? I mean, this crowd is really eager to see him do something. This crowd is really eager to hear Jesus say something. One of my favorite movies is the movie Tombstone. It's a movie about Wyatt Earp. It's actually the most historically accurate movie about Wyatt Earp. Now, in that movie, Wyatt Earp really has just one friend, one really good friend. And his name is Doc Holliday. Now, towards the end of the film, Doc Holliday is getting ready to have a gunfight with the #1 gunfighter in the world. His name is Johnny Ringo. And when Doc Holliday shows up to fight Johnny Ringo, Doc Holliday takes the lapel of his coat and he opens it up. And you see attached to his vest is a badge. I think it's a U.S. Marshal badge. And then Doc Holliday says these words to Johnny Ringo. This time it's legal. And of course they have a gunfight, and guess who wins? Doc Holliday. And as Johnny Ringo lay on the ground, Doc Holliday walks up to him, takes the badge off his vest, and he places it on Johnny Ringo's body. And then he says this as he adjusts the badge. My hypocrisy only goes so far. In other words, it really wasn't legal. Doc Holliday was just pretending to be a U.S. Marshal. Now, why does Jesus then call this crowd hypocrites? It's because their eagerness for Jesus will only go so far. What are they eager about? Why are they there to see him? It's simply to see Jesus do something. It's simply there to hear Jesus say something. They're simply only there to observe. Now, how do we know that they're simply only there to observe? Well, Jesus tells us. You're observing, you're just not interpreting. You know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time? See, they're there observing the present time. They're there looking at all the facts, and the facts are this. Jesus does remarkable things, and Jesus has said some astounding things. But it only goes so far. They haven't gone so far to actually interpret the facts. They haven't gone so far to actually interpret what does he mean. And I don't mean by saying that, what does he mean by what he does, and what does he mean by what he says? But what he does and what he says something about him. What does the appearance of him mean? You know, as Luke's gospel began, we kind of started there. We started in Luke 2 when the shepherds went and saw the baby wrapped in swaddling cloths. And then they interpreted what they saw. It was a correct interpretation, and they applied it to their lives. We see it again in Luke 2 with Simeon and Anna. Simeon and Anna, two very older believers, they saw baby Jesus. They saw him. They observed the fact he is here. What does this mean? What does he mean? They interpreted it, and then they applied it to their lives. We see with the disciples. When the disciples saw Jesus, they observed the fact he's here. This is quite remarkable. There's never been anyone quite like him. They interpreted what it meant and what it meant for them. And what was the application? They left everything and followed him. So this has been happening in Luke, in the Gospel of Luke so far. And here, Jesus, it's almost like he's had enough. He's done a lot of remarkable things. He said a lot of astounding things. And he finally says to the crowd, what are you going to do with it? You've been observing, but your hypocrisy only lets you go so far. You're refusing to interpret what I mean, what the present time means. Isn't it interesting that Jesus uses those words, you do not know how to interpret the present time? I thought about that for a while. What is the present time? I kind of alluded to it already. The present time is obviously not the past, and it's not the future, it's the now. Jesus is here, and he's telling them, the crowd, what are you seeing? Look at the facts. What do you see? And what you have to answer, what then does this mean? The present time is simply Jesus. He's here. Now, in the verses that follow, the fact that he's here does have a bearing on the future. It does impact the future. But what's really important is that right now you interpret the present time. And again, the present time is him. What does he mean? What does he mean that he's here? That he's here, what does he mean for my life? And see, I think that's the reason that he calls them hypocrites. They'll only go so far. They're not going to make that interpretation, because if they make that interpretation, there's something that will be demanded of them. If you make that interpretation of who Jesus is, what's the point unless you're going to do something about it? Does that make sense? Make a little bit of sense? So here we go. Why do you not know how to interpret the present time? Look at verse 57. And why do you not judge for yourselves what is right? See that word "and" in verse 57? That connects back to verse 56. So the question in verse 57 is related to the question in verse 56. And it's just what Jesus laid out for us in verses 54 through 55. What's the first thing you do when it comes to the weather? You observe. The second thing, you make an interpretation. You say something about the facts. And once you make an observation, and once you say something about the facts, what's the next thing you have to do? You have to make an application. So we know when they saw the cloud rising and said, a storm's coming, they had to do something. They had to leap into action. They grabbed their raincoats. They grabbed their umbrella. When they said, hey, the south wind is blowing, they made an interpretation. It's going to be a hot one tomorrow. So what did they do? They leapt into action. They turn on the air conditioner. They make sure there's plenty of ice cream. They make sure they have some cold water to drink. They make sure they have some shade to sit under. I want to think back to how we know that when Jesus says the present time, he's talking about himself. How is it that he's the present time? How is it that we can say when he says, you do not know how to interpret the present time, that he's actually saying to them, you don't know how to interpret me. You're not interpreting what I mean in being here right now. I want to show you something. Go to Isaiah chapter 25. I thought this was pretty neat. Isaiah chapter 25. I want to start in Isaiah chapter 25 by reading one verse. It's the first verse. Isaiah chapter 25, verse 1. Just listen to it as we begin. It's really important. O Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will praise your name. For what reason? You have done wonderful things, plans formed of old, faithful and sure. Okay, now here's what I really want to show you. Look at verse 4. Isaiah chapter 25, verse 4. For you have been a stronghold to the poor, a stronghold to the needy in his distress, a shelter from the storm and a shade from the heat. For the breath of the ruthless is like a storm against a wall. Wait a minute, let's read that one more time. Isaiah chapter 25, verse 4. You have been a stronghold to the poor. You have been a stronghold to the needy in his distress. What does he say next? A shelter from the storm and a shade from the heat. I thought it was interesting in Luke chapter 12 that when Jesus talks to the crowd, he brings up two occurrences about the weather. Now, I'm sure there's other occurrences about the weather, but he brought up two occurrences about the weather to this particular group that they could really relate to. It was to when storms come and to when it gets really hot. And I wondered why he did that. And I think the obvious reason is, well, they know that. This happens often in Israel, that when a cloud comes up over the west, we know a storm is coming. And when a south wind blows from the south, we know it's going to be really hot. But I think he does it for this reason, to relate them to himself. And it goes back here to Isaiah 25. And when Isaiah says something about the Lord in verse 4, what has he said? You are a shelter to us when it storms. You are a shade to us when it gets really hot. And so when it comes to interpreting the present time, it's almost as if Jesus is saying this to them. This is who I am. Look at the physical realm. You know what to do when a storm is coming. You get to where there's shelter. You grab an umbrella. You know what to do when it gets really hot out. You look for shade. And that's how you are to relate to me. I am that shelter to you in the great storm. I am that shade to you when it gets really, really hot. Why is it that you refuse to interpret what I mean, that the presence of me means for you right now? And I think the answer is clearly this, is because if I interpret what Jesus means for me right now, I have to do something about it. And that's the reason for that question in verse 57. Why do you not interpret the present time? Well, it's verse 57, that connecting word, and why do you not judge for yourselves what is right? And it's simply this. If I interpret, I know what the facts are. Jesus has done remarkable things and Jesus has said some astounding things. I must make an interpretation about him. And why is it that so many don't? It's because if once you make that interpretation, and you have to come to this realization, either Jesus is who he says he is, and his works, what he has done, are a demonstration of who he is, or he is simply either a good teacher, and a good teacher would never say the things that Jesus said, or he's a liar. You have to make an interpretation about him. And once you make the conclusion, he has to be something more than a good moral teacher. Would a good moral teacher make claims like this before Abraham was, I am? Would a good moral teacher make a claim like this, that Abraham saw my day and rejoiced? When Jesus made those claims, those who heard it knew exactly what he was saying. They said this, pick up a stone and stone him, for he's making himself out to be God himself. Well, if you're not ready to say that Jesus is God, the only other conclusion you have to come to based on what the scriptures say he has done and the scriptures say he said is that he is a liar. And so you have to ask yourself, am I prepared to tell Jesus to his face, you're nothing but a liar? See, based on the facts, there's only two things you can really say about him. And if he's not a liar, that means he must be who he says he is. He must be who he's demonstrated himself to be. And if that's true, if you come to that interpretation, what's the point unless you do something about it? And that's the point of verses 57 through 59. Jesus says this in verse 57, "Why do you not judge for yourselves what is right?" Now, Jesus is not saying, you just determine what's right and wrong. He's not saying that at all. He's saying, why do you not judge for yourselves what is right? Why would I judge for myself what is right? It's about getting right. And it gets further explained there in verse 58. He says, as you go with your accuser before the magistrate. What's the point of an accuser? An accuser tells you, you've done something wrong. That's the point of the question. Why do you not judge for yourselves what is right? Meaning, why don't you make things right? Why don't you recognize and listen to the accuser? The accuser has said, you have done wrong. Judge for yourselves what is right. And what's the reason I would do that? It's to make things right. This is a really interesting parable. We can call it a parable. In verse 58, Jesus is telling his story, and a story to illustrate a truth. And the truth is this: now is the time. Once you come to interpretation of who Jesus is based on the facts, you must do something about it. And the thing to do is this: you better judge for yourselves what is right. Take a good look at you and make it right. Well, right in what way? Well, it gets pointed out here in this parable. We'll read it and then go back and explain it. As you go with your accuser before the magistrate, make an effort to settle with him on the way, lest he drag you to the judge, and the judge hand you over to the officer, and the officer put you in prison. I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the very last penny. Now, there's another time that Jesus tells this parable. And the other time he tells this parable is back in Matthew chapter 5. I think it's around verses 22 through 27. And Jesus introduces that parable in a really interesting way. And the parable is almost word for word as you see it here. So I do think that Jesus told this parable on two separate occasions and in two separate contexts. In Matthew 5, the context is this. And Jesus, he begins it like this. Hey, when you go to worship, when you go to before the altar at the synagogue, and you've brought a gift to offer to God, so let's just frame it that way. When you gather to worship God, as you get ready to do that, and you remember, I've done something to hurt my brother. I've wronged my brother. Jesus said, put your gift down, leave, go find your brother, and get right with him. And then he tells this parable. And when he tells this parable, we can obviously say the accuser in the parable is who? It's your brother. It's the person you have wronged. And what's interesting, when Jesus tells this parable a second time, he doesn't identify the accuser for us. So he doesn't introduce it the way he did in Matthew. And I think it's for this reason. The accuser, it is someone that you have a relationship with. Just like in Matthew 5, the accuser is your brother. That's a familial relationship. Another way of thinking of a brother is maybe like another church member, another Christian. But here it's never identified, and I think it's for this reason. the accuser is still kind of the same. It's a person that you have relationship with, but the relationship is broken. For what reason? I have committed a wrong. I have wronged this accuser. I have wronged this person I am meant to have a relationship with. Now, pay close attention to what I'm about ready to say. Jesus does not identify the accuser for us. But I think it's clear the accuser is someone that you have wronged. And it's beginning with that question. Why do you not judge for yourselves what is right? Why would I judge for myself what is right? It's to make it right. I need to judge for myself what is right because I've committed a wrong. I have wronged somebody. So the accuser here is someone I have wronged. I think the accuser here is God. Each and every one of us was made to have relationship with God. But that relationship is broken. And it was broken by one way. Sin broke that relationship. Each and every single one of us is a sinner. Our own personal sin, the wrongs we have committed, have broken that relationship we were meant to have with God. And so the presence of Jesus, the fact that he is here, that he came and he has done some remarkable things and he has said some astounding things, was for this reason. It's to get the relationship right with God. And that's part of making the interpretation of what Jesus means and what he means for my life. Once I make that interpretation, I have to do something about it. And what do I have to do? Get right with God. And when is the time to get right with God? Well, it's not the past. And what's the reason for that? Well, the past is past. It's not the future. And it's not the future because I'm only guaranteed today. And another reason it's not the future is because when the future comes, it's too late. There is going to become a time that every single one of us will stand before the judge. The time to get right with God is not when you stand before the judge. The time to get right with God is the present. And so Jesus is begging the crowd almost. As you go with your accuser, do you see where this life is leading? This life that we're all living is leading to the appointment day that we all have before the judge. The future. It's all leading to the future. Well, we each will stand before the judge. Jesus is saying to the crowd, now is the present time. And in this present time, as you go with your accuser before the judge, look what he says in verse 58. You make the effort to settle with him on the way. Why would I do that? So I don't have to get dragged before the judge. If I don't make an effort to settle with God on the way, and by the way, the only way to settle with God is with Jesus. He is the only way to settle with God. We'll see that why in a second. Why would I make an effort now to get settled with God? Well, if I don't, I'm going to get dragged to the judge. And the judge is going to hand me over to the officer. Why is that? Because I am wrong. I am in the wrong. I have done wrong. I am guilty. There's no doubt about it. And the judge will hand you over to the officer, and the officer put you in prison. Verse 59, I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the very last penny. I kind of thought, well, how do you pay anything if you're from prison? And the answer is, you don't. You don't have the means to pay your debt if you're locked away in prison. And it's interesting, Jesus uses the words, until you have paid the very last penny. The literal word there for penny would be like 1/8 of our penny. You're not going to get out of that prison until you have paid the very last 1/8 of a cent. See, there's no, oh, you have half a penny left in your debt, it's forgiven. No, it's you won't get out until the very last eighth is paid. So when do I need to settle with my accuser? It's right now. Jesus is the only way to get settled with God. We know that from John 14:6. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me. Go to Colossians 1. Colossians 1, verse 20. Actually, let's start at verse 19. Colossians 1, starting with verse 19. Talking about Jesus, Paul writes in Colossians 1:19, for in Jesus all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. Verse 20, and through him, through Jesus, to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. Turn the page to Colossians 2 and look at verses 13 through 15. And you, who were dead in your trespasses. Another word for trespasses would be the wrongs I have committed. Let's say you've only committed one wrong. Maybe you're that good. You've only committed one wrong. Well, even all and you who are dead, even in the one wrong you have committed, and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses. How'd he do it? Verse 14, by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him, in Jesus. And that's why I say the only way to get right with the accuser, and it's just God saying, you've committed wrong. You need to get right. The only way to get right is there at the cross, because it's only at the cross that my debt has been canceled. It's only at the cross that my debt gets forgiven. And it's only because of Jesus, who was sent to do that for me. And so if I refuse to interpret what he means, why he was sent, why he did the things he did, and why he said the things he said, if I refuse to interpret that, well, there's no room for application. But if I do interpret it, and I do take a look at who he is, and I agree, he is God, he is the one sent to die for my sins, I need to then do something about it. Otherwise, what's the point? And what do I need to do about it? It's called turn to him and repent and thank him for the forgiveness he has offered, the debt he has canceled for my sake, so that I might get right with God. So you see, Luke 12, I think, is a rather significant chapter for us, and it's a rather significant chapter for the Gospel of Luke. It's here in this moment. Jesus just spells it out. And he tells the crowds, it's enough. There's been almost 12 chapters of this, of me showing who I am by the things I do, and me saying who I am by the things I say. And each time, your hypocrisy will only take you so far. When are you finally going to interpret what all of this means and do something about it? And there's the application for all of us. And we take a good look at Jesus and we interpret what he means, who he is, and who he is to me and for my life right now. We then have to do something about it. Otherwise, what's the point?